see how it turns out. But it's been 3 years since I cut down a tree, and I gotta tell you, I feel 3 years older right now.
Now technically, we have 3 native species of oak trees around here: white oak, black oak, and live oak. But in real terms, the live oak doesn't amount to anything. In fact, you almost never see one. The white oak makes the best lumber, but it rarely grows to a size or a quality that you can get much out of it. Typically, it's kind of a short, crooked, and limby tree, and it's usually just cut up for firewood and very little else. But I've been eyeballing this little stand of trees for years on my way back and forth to Cy Swan's place, and I finally approached Mike and his son-in-law Aaron about selling me a few of them. I found 6 that were over 20 inches in diameter, up around 10 or 12 feet off the ground, which I have learned is pretty much the minimum size of a tree that's going to make any real premium clear vertical grain boards. And that's what I want. And we settled on $400 a piece, which is about a third more than what firewood price would be. Now, in agreeing to the price, I am really buying a pig in a poke here, because when these trees hit the ground, I bought them. Whether or not they are sound, whether or not they're going to make the boards I need, they're mine. But I'm willing to take the chance. Now, I know that a lot of you have wondered out loud why in the world I've got a 36-inch bar on my saw. But by the end of this video, I'm guessing it won't seem quite so silly. I'm cutting these guys down in January while the sap is still down, before they bud out and start putting on leaves. And I hope to get a sawmill up here to cut them into lumber perhaps in May, maybe June, before fire season starts.
We're cutting down some oak trees this morning, about 5 of them, maybe 6. You've seen me do this before because I was also then trying to get some clear vertical grain white oak lumber. But those trees didn't make the grain characteristic I was hoping for, so we're trying it again. A little bigger wood, we'll be a little more careful in turning it into the boards. We'll see how it turns out. We did something other, we used an open face instead of a Humboldt face this time. First time I've done that, made me a little nervous, but we'll just keep pushing forward and see how the day goes.
Now, before I take one more breath, I've got to thank the folks at Western Equipment and Supply, because I walked in there about a week ago and asked them if they'd tune up my saw, and they didn't have time. But they went out of their way, they went way out of their way to get this old guy tuned up for me by the weekend. And they showed me a lot of good sharpening tips, too, that I should have picked up on years ago. Now, the way I see it, the whole mindset around falling a tree is figuring out how to cut a great big hinge into the middle of the standing tree, with the hinge perpendicular to the direction the tree has to fall, while the whole weight of the tree is pushing down on the hinge and on your saw, with the tree leaning wherever it's leaning, tangled up with whatever it's tangled up with, while the wind is blowing wherever the wind is blowing, while not wrecking anything on the ground or killing anyone in the process. And then, did I mention that at least in this case, it's to be done with the camera running on every move? Now, I know that sounded a lot like a whine, didn't it? But the fact is that for a young man with a good saw in good timber, there is no better way to spend a working day if it isn't snowing.
So we did a video 3 years ago when I did this last time about the danger of barber chairing oak and limb heavy and leaning oak, loving to split. And this tree wasn't leaning much, but it was real limb heavy. I mean, it wanted to go. And just the size of the tree and the fact that it's nice and it's expensive and I didn't want to wreck it, I decided to bore in and then cut out the back rather than starting at the back and cutting into the middle. And in both cases, I just felt a little less apprehensive if, once I got it under control, if I bored in and took the heart out, because the heart loves to pull big splinters out, and what you're trying to do when you cut down a tree like this is preserve the first saw log, because the first saw log is where the bulk of the scale is. And so you cut the stump low and you try to keep her from splitting and you try not to get killed. You know, I don't know how much tension it takes to just part, 12 square inches of green sapwood, white oak. A lot. But when I got down to that last 2x8, bam, it just pulled it in half, which gives you an idea that yes, it was leaning hard. And if I would have come in from the back, by the time the energy it took to tear that apart was just trying to bend the tree over, it could easily have split. So you can look at that other video if you're interested, but I think we're going to get all these on the ground today without wrecking any of them. I hope.
I got this tree sort of as a bonus to the deal because about a third of it split off a couple years ago in a big snowfall event that we call Snowmageddon. I hope there's going to be some good wood in this thing once I get it on the ground and open it up. Just a couple of things about falling a tree out of a twinned pair like this, two kind of growing up out of one stump, or two stumps that are laced together, I guess. It's not likely, but sometimes if you cut off one, especially the bigger of the two, the other one is suddenly unbalanced. And if it's leaning hard, and if the ground is wet, like it is today, it can heave the stump and topple right over. So keep an eye on it for a while. Another thing about cutting down a tree is before you're too far into it, take a minute, look around, and clear your escape path. Get any trip hazards off the ground. I mean, early, right? Because there are moments when a man just can't afford to fall down. These plastic falling wedges are an absolute necessity for a cutter, and there are lots of tricks and different ways to use them. As it turned out, I really did not need to put this thing in here, but I got a little nervous. And you have to realize that it's a lot easier to slip one into the back cut before the tree sits back down on you and on your saw and you are really, really stuck.
That wedge was way too long anyway. Firewood and the rest. Great. Let's go do the tricky ones.
At lunchtime, I went back down to the truck and then drove a couple miles up to Si's shop to borrow a file. It's a lot bigger than I needed, but boy was I glad to get it. Because there should be between 20 and 30 thousandths, which is less than a 32nd of an inch, between the top of the teeth and the top of the rakers. You can buy a gauge for this, and I guess I ought to get one, because the height of the rakers determines how much wood each tooth is pulling out of the cut. So this guy's being used as a gatepost of sorts, and it belongs to a neighbor, Chris. So along with the purchase of the tree, I hired Chris to help me out a little bit with his excavator. It's a nice machine, and boy was it great to have him here to move things around and clean things up. You see these stringy stalks climbing up the side of this tree? This is poison oak, and it's a real problem around here. It gives a lot of people a nasty, itching, weeping rash that can take a long time to heal up. And as a kid, it really made my life miserable around hunting season. Now, after a while, I got pretty well immune to it. But Nate hasn't gotten immune to it yet, so we're trying to keep him out of it as much as we can, even though in the winter, when the leaves are off, it's not near as threatening as in the summer. This stuff gets pretty big. In fact, when I was logging, there were a few times that I cut through poison oak stems that were 5 inches in diameter.
So I think I've got my saw sharp now. It was sharp when I started this morning, but the rakers were too high, and so you may have noticed that I was just pulling dust instead of chips. Hopefully we'll do better on this tree. But the thing that's standing in opposition to that is that this fence was buried in this tree, and those staples and wires will really foul up a nice sharp chain. So I'm going to try to chop those out that are down here where I may be cutting. I painted them so when the sawmill gets here we can chop those out and make sure we don't foul up a bandsaw. Let's see how far inside of this tree these things are. So if you haven't picked up on it already, this was an exceptionally nice day in the middle of January in southern Oregon. It probably should have been pouring buckets of rain, and if it would have been, I would not have been cutting these trees because I'm kind of a fair weather logger these days. Now the real timber cutters, and when I was logging as a younger man for a living, you couldn't let a little thing like rain stop you on a day like this. In fact, cutters don't pay much attention to the weather at all, with a couple of exceptions. The first is snow. Deep snow makes it impossible to shovel out down to the tree, to get low enough to the ground to cut that first log properly and see where your face is oriented. Snow messes you up, and besides that, you can't run away. And the other thing that is a more common interruption to the workflow around here is wind. Trees are a huge wind sail. And tipping that center of gravity over in the direction the tree has to go is a very delicate thing at that last possible moment. And you do not need a gust of wind or even a gentle breeze pushing against you and setting up a situation where somebody could really get hurt. You see these chaps that I'm wearing? If you can't tell by how clean they are, I am responding to the pressure of the camera having them on this morning, because as a kid and as a young man doing this every day, chaps were really almost unheard of in the brush. A couple of reasons, I guess, for that, and one was that safety did not have the sort of trump card position that it has now. And second, the real consciousness of cutters then and now is not getting hung up in the brush. And yep, these chaps, I can see, could really save you from cuts and gouges and, maybe even save your life. But they come with the offsetting sort of downside of they give you a couple more straps down around your calves of your legs to hang up in the brush when you're trying to get away. So it's just one more thing to keep track of and one more thing to be aware of, and maybe at a particular moment, one more thing to be thankful for. There are a couple of things that I'm thinking about as I'm bucking these logs to length. Part of what I'm doing is trying to isolate any defects into one log if I can. I want the maximum amount of scale or lumber volume to be the best quality possible.
I'm also keeping in mind the project that I intend to use this on, and the board sizes and lengths that I'm really going to wish I had available 2 or 3 years from now when I tear into the house. The volume and the value of logs, at least of the softwood, the industrially processed Douglas fir and cedar and white fir and the other commercially harvested species, is determined by people who are called log scalers. They calculate the volume of wood by taking the average diameter at the small end and projecting it down the length of the log. This imaginary shape is called the scaling cylinder. Then certain cuts or subtractions are made from that gross volume for each of the visible defects that can be found by looking at the outside of the log itself. Scalers are ideally an impartial third party that determines the money that the logger receives from the sawmill owners that the logs are sold to. They provide an important service to the lumber industry. I don't care what the job is. Cleanup is important. And a lot of times it can set apart the top hands from the wannabes. As part of that, I knew that this fence was going to need to be repaired, and I was not crazy about trying to dig a post hole down next to an oak stump. So I welded up a post out of a piece of pipe and some number 6 rebar. And man, it felt good to watch this bucket push that post into the ground. Easiest post I ever set. Nate and I had a good time up here. It was a great day. And I want to thank Aaron, Mike, and Chris for making it possible. I'm looking forward to being back up here in 4 or 5 months to turn these beauties into really nice lumber and some pretty good firewood. Thanks for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.